Good evening. I think we're warming the mic up here. All right, welcome everybody. It's exciting to see such a great crowd for the Brant lecture this evening. I'm Mark Bannister. I'm interim dean of the College of Business and Economics, and I welcome you, and I'm pleased that you have the opportunity to be with us this evening. Now, my script says that I'm supposed to take a moment and ask everybody to silence your cell phone if you've not already. I made sure mine was a few minutes ago, but we'd prefer not to have those interruptions this evening. I'd like to express deep gratitude to John and Ora Brandt Foundation for supporting this lecture this evening and for the many things that you do for this region and for Boise State. John and Ora Brandt's extraordinary lives and commitment to their community, described in tonight's program, continue to make a significant contribution to the people of Idaho. If you've not looked, there's a very nice write-up within the program. Tonight, I'd like to acknowledge the trustees of the Brandt Foundation. Don Brandt was unable to be here tonight. Bob Rathbone is up here in the front. Judge J.R. Schiller. JR is right here, Judge. Don Anderson, we heard, is actually overseas tonight. What an excuse. John Barnes, thank you, John, appreciate your support. Mike Siegermersa is, Siegermersa, I'm sorry. Siegermersa. Anyway, Mike, good to have you here, thank you. I'm going to get my mind around that word. But anyway, I appreciate the community supporters and attendees that are here, as well as members of the university community. And something that I'd like to share tonight is that the College of Business and Economics and the Brandt Foundation have entered into a new agreement to continue this lecture series and to support the teaching and research of the new Brandt Fellow of Free Enterprise Capitalism, Professor Ann Walker. And Ann is here, and she will be introducing this evening's speaker. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean Bannister. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight, and welcome to the 14th Annual Brandt Foundation Lecture. One more friendly reminder to please silence your cell phones in case you didn't heed the first reminder. After tonight's talk is finished, you'll have an opportunity for a Q&A session. Once that begins, if you would like to ask a question, proceed to the aisle where Boise State students from our MBA program and our Economics Master's program will assist you. If you don't stay for the Q&A session and leave, we ask that you please do so with as much of a minimal disruption as possible so that people who are staying are not disrupted. We would like to hear your feedback, so as you leave, please feel free to use the feedback forms that are found within your programs. And if you are a student here getting credit or extra credit, you can drop off your extra credit slips in the designated boxes out in the hallway. Biographical information for tonight's speaker is available in the program that you can find on your seat, but you can also find information about tonight's speaker and all of our speakers at boisestate.edu/Brandt Foundation. My introduction will be relatively brief because you're here to hear ideas as opposed to my introduction. But the purpose of the Brandt Foundation Lecture Series is to bring to Idaho public speakers who are making important contributions to the public understanding of the foundations of a free and prosperous society. A free and prosperous society is built upon freedom of enterprise, freedom of movement, and freedom of trade. Free trade has been increasingly under attack in recent times, especially within the last few years. False arguments rebutted by economists continue to resurface as if economists had never rebutted these arguments before. It rewards us to relearn the benefits of free trade and the false promises of protectionism. David Henderson, tonight's speaker, is particularly well suited to this task. For over 3 decades, he's been one of the preeminent public voices for the principles of free enterprise capitalism. As a professor at the Naval Postgraduate School, he was honored 4 times for his teaching excellence. He has written widely for circulated newspapers such as the Wall Street Journal, magazines such as Fortune, and has appeared on nearly all of the major news outlets for financial news, including CNN, PBS, CNBC, MSNBC. His public service also includes serving on President Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors as a senior economist for energy and health policy. The Brant Foundation Lecture Series is honored to present tonight's speaker, David Henderson, and his topic, The Case for Free Trade. Please welcome David Henderson.
Thanks, thanks, Ann, and thank you. How's my volume? Good, good. Now let's hope these slides work. There we go. Well, you know what? She did such a good job, and your thing did such a good job. Now, I know I'm supposed to stay in a light here. Is this okay? That I don't need to go through all that stuff or that, but I am kind of proud of that. Now, I talked to a number of high school students a few minutes ago. I'm the guy on the right, okay? Do you know who the guy on the left is? I said I'd quiz you. Who's the guy on the left? I wanted to ask them. That's Ronald Reagan. Okay, and I worked under him for a couple of years. Okay, and also there's a couple other little show and tells. This is what I'm most likely to be remembered for, the Concise Encyclopedia of Economics. It's this big, thick book. What do you mean concise? Well, each little entry in it is concise. That's what I'm most likely to be remembered for. This is what I'd like to be remembered for, The Joy of Freedom, An Economist's Odyssey. It's kind of my story about how I came to my belief in freedom generally and economic freedom particularly. So anyway, that's a little background. Also, Ann mentioned the Wall Street Journal. Who here reads the Wall Street Journal regularly? Okay, a whole bunch of people in front for some reason. So back in 1996, I made an offer to the Wall Street Journal that I could save them one 24-hour news cycle by writing the article on whoever the Nobel Prize winner was that morning, and it would get published the next day, rather than being a 48-hour lag. There was a 24-hour lag. And I said, I won't mislead you. If I don't know enough to write it, I won't write it. I've written it 19 out of the last 24 years, and this was the most recent one. This was one where I actually got a little critical of the Nobel Prize winners and got some pushback on that from some people, but I still think I was right. And in fact, one of the things I talk about is relevant tonight. So now, what I told Alan Dalton when he asked me to give this speech, and it's taking over from him, he's the one who lined me up, was he wanted to have it titled The Economic Case for Free Trade. And I said, that's not quite right. I will mainly make the economic case for free trade, but I want to start by making the moral, ethical, philosophic case for free trade. And here's what I will say. There's a moral presumption in favor of free trade. In favor of the presumption is that the government should allow people to trade freely unless there are really, really strong reasons against. So what would be not a strong reason? I don't like what he bought, right? That suit looks ugly. You shouldn't have bought it. Well, too bad. I kind of like it, okay? So I want to then add to that moral presumption by pointing out something that a Yale law professor said. Oops, is that going to be? Yeah, I'll go back to that. This Yale law professor, Stephen L. Carter, said the following. Every law is violent. We try not to think about this, but we should. On the first day of law school, I tell my contract students never to argue for invoking the power of law, except in a cause for which they are willing to kill. You get that? Willing to kill. They are suitably astonished and often annoyed. But I point out that even a breach of contract requires a judicial remedy. And if the breacher will not pay damages, the sheriff will sequester his house and goods. And if he resists the forced sale of his property, the sheriff might have to shoot him. So remember, if you're advocating restrictions on trade, be aware that you might be advocating having people killed. So I think that's a bit of a moral case, isn't it? Okay, now let me go back. How does this work? Here's the basic fact about trade. Trade, exchange, they mean the same thing. Both sides gain from exchange. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. Now, when I teach classes of 30, I retired a few years ago, when I taught classes of 30, I would ask someone to volunteer. I'm not sure I'll get there with this size group. Anyone willing to stand up who bought something? No? Okay. Aha! Alan.
Okay.
That's a really nice tie.
Thank you.
Did you buy Did you buy it? What'd you pay?
I have no idea. It's been quite a while.
Okay, what do you think roughly?
Maybe $25, $30.
Okay, let's go with 25.
Okay.
Anyone ever remember Johnny Carson when he played that guy? These people do, you people don't. Okay. Okay, I'm going to be that guy. What was his name? Kardash, okay. Kardash. Cardan? Okay. See, I didn't. It was too late at night for me to watch. Cardan. I'm Cardan. I say, Karnak. Thank you. I say Alan valued that tie at more than $25. Am I right?
You're right.
Wow! Am I ever smart? I knew that. Wait a minute, you might be thinking, am I smart? Maybe, maybe not. But there's a principle there that's smart. And the principle is both sides gain from exchange. He must have valued it more than the $25 he gave up, or he wouldn't have bought it. That's a very powerful principle. When I taught economics for 30-some years, the first day of class I taught the 10 pillars of economic wisdom, and that was pillar number 4. Both sides gain from exchange. And one way to test that principle is to take it to an extreme and see if it bends or breaks. So I'm going to give, this first example is completely made up. You're out in the desert in Ethiopia, and you're dehydrating, and you're crawling on all fours, and you look up and you see this sign, Rita's Friendly Oasis. And as you get closer, you realize it's not a mirage, it's real. And she has water. And you say, Rita, can I have some water? And Rita says, sure. Oh, it's $50,000. 2 quarts for $50,000. And you know that if you drank those 2 quarts, you would rehydrate and you would save your life. I have to add a little other fact. You're carrying an American Express card, no limit. Question. what do you do? What do you do? Someone said it. Mimi? You buy the water. I taught military officers for 30-some years. When I had Marines in my class, they said I shoot her, okay? But I say, no, Rita has a gun and you don't have a gun, okay? And you're really weak because of all that crawling. So you buy the water. Okay, you buy the water. Did Rita gain from that exchange? Yeah, 50 grand probably minus a penny. Did you gain from that exchange? You survived. Both sides gained from exchange. Notice that I took the most extreme example you could take of a monopoly. She's the only game in town and your life is at stake. And even in that extreme case, both sides gained from exchange. That's a pretty powerful principle. No one said that they have to gain equally. One might gain a lot, one might gain a little. But actually, if you look at the facts, who gained more? You or Rita? You did. She gained 50 grand minus a penny. You gained your life minus 50. So if you valued your life at over $100,000, you gain more. Now that was a made-up example. Let me take an example of international trade that is not made up. There are companies around the world in various very poor countries that subcontract to companies like Nike and so on. And they hire young people, sometimes 12-year-olds, and to work in these factories. And they pay them as little as $1 an hour. And by the way, almost all the examples, and this matters, are examples of people who are there voluntarily. They're working voluntarily. Question: does the company gain from that exchange? Yeah. Do the workers gain from that exchange? Yeah. Now, I can be what's called an armchair economist. I can sit back, I can look at the fact that it was a voluntary exchange and say both sides gain. But there are people who are kind of curious, and they've gone to some of those countries. So there was a person, a woman on NPR, who went to one of those countries. I think you could tell by the tone of her report, she was expecting to come back with horror stories, but she was an honest reporter. And she came back and said, these people are doing great. Compared to us, no. Compared to what they had. There was a New York Times reporter, and you had the same feel from his report when he came back. He went to Honduras, and he talked to this person who said, when I go back to my town, people notice I've gained 30 pounds, and there, that's a good thing, right? And they say, how can I get one of those jobs? They are doing better. What did they typically do before they got those jobs? Where did they work? In the fields. In the fields for longer hours, less pay, and I didn't use the word sweatshops, but talk about sweat under that sun. So that principle that people gain from exchange is very, very powerful. Okay, now, there's something in economics that Adam Smith did not understand, but the wealthiest economist 40 years later, a guy named David Ricardo, did understand, and that's the lesson of comparative advantage. And what he pointed out, what he argued, and he showed a little arithmetic example. And in an earlier draft of this talk, I had an arithmetic example, and I thought, 7:30 at night, large audience, don't do it. So I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it with a couple of non-arithmetic examples to kind of make the point. But here's the point. You should produce and sell the item in which you have a comparative advantage. That is, the item which you produce at lower cost compared to other people. That's the principle. And the more we extend trade, so think about trading between California, where I live, and Idaho. Then you get comparative advantage. Then take the next step between United States and China. Then you get more comparative advantage, and so on. So you just extend, and get a more extensive division of labor that makes pretty much everyone better off. I'll talk about a few exceptions in a little while. But that's the principle. Now, I want to do it with 3 illustrations of real people. Oh, there's David Ricardo. Who's that? Babe Ruth. Raise your hand if you've heard of Babe Ruth, not the candy bar. All right, even the high school students. Good. Okay, question. What was Babe Ruth's first position in baseball? Pitcher. Was he like a so-so lousy pitcher? He was really good. Well, then why did they take him out of being a pitcher and have him be, what is he, in the field, I think? He's in the field. Or what was he? Right field. Why'd they do that? Comparative advantage. If he pitched, he could play maybe 1 every 4 games. But if he was in right field, he could play in every game, and that meant he could hit. Okay? Now let's go a little closer to our time with another example that I just learned a couple of months ago. Who are these people? Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, the 2 remaining Beatles who are alive. Question that I bet a lot of you don't know, but you'll probably get or else I wouldn't be asking. Who was the better drummer? Paul. Yeah. It's in one of the econ textbooks now. But wait a minute, Paul was the better drummer. Why was Ringo the drummer? Because Paul was an incredible singer. His comparative advantage was in singing. Okay, and now another one. I'm getting closer and closer to our time. Dikembe Mutombo. Who here remembers when he was in college and he'd do a block and he'd go like that, right? Famous basketball player. When he came to United States, did he plan to be a basketball player? No, he did not. He wanted to train to be a doctor and go back to the Congo and be a doctor and help his people. But he found out he was pretty good at basketball. So he made a lot of money in basketball, started a foundation, used some money he earned, put it into the foundation, raised other funds, and built a major hospital in the Congo where he hired multiple doctors and multiple nurses. That's comparative advantage. So that's the best I can do at explaining comparative advantage without arithmetic. Okay. Now, none of the analysis of trade and gains from exchange changes if you move across a border. There's nothing magic in that sense about a border. And there's something called an economist riddle. We economists probably get more kick out of it than other people. But here's the riddle. How do you grow Toyotas in an Iowa cornfield? You grow corn. Then you trade for a Prius. That's how you do it. Now that's a standard example that I gave for years before Donald Trump ran for president. But I watched very carefully a talk he gave in July 2015, just after he'd announced. It was a talk in Las Vegas, and here's what he said. The biggest boats I've ever seen. I just left Los Angeles. Thousands of cars, millions of cars coming in from Japan. We get nothing. We get cars. We want to send rice. They want to send corn. The imbalance of these things. They send a car. We send corn. Well, at the time, here's what I blogged. Yes, and what's wrong with trading corn for cars? He says later in his talk they won't even take our products. So which is it? Do we send corn or don't we send corn? This is about comparative advantage. And then he went on. You call up about your American Express card. Someone's on the phone with a little bit of an accent. Where are you from? Oh, this is New Delhi. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And he said it very sarcastically. Why can't it be from Arizona, from New York, from Las Vegas, Nevada? Why can't it be in this country? You would think it's impossible. How can it be from that far away and they save money? How could it be right? They're from India. Well, here was the response I wrote. It could be done here, but it would be much more expensive. If people were on the phone in the United States, they wouldn't be doing the work they're doing. The prices paid to people in India are well below the prices that we pay to U.S. workers, which is why U.S. workers wouldn't find it attractive to work in those jobs, and instead work in jobs where they produce more value. So that, again, is comparative advantage. Now, what do politicians do when they object to trade? They typically impose two kinds of restrictions on trade. One is tariffs, and one is import quotas. And Trump referred to himself as a tariff man. He tends to favor tariffs. And actually, by the way, there's a good economic argument that for a given restriction of trade, tariffs are better than import quotas. I'm not going to lay it out. It's slightly complicated, but there is a good economic argument. But that's if you take as given you want to restrict trade, and that shouldn't be taken as given. Because whom do tariffs hurt? They hurt two groups. So let's say, we don't have to make this hypothetical, he imposes tariffs on steel from Canada, where I'm from, eh? Whom does that hurt? Who's obvious that it hurts? Canadian producers of steel. Who else does it hurt? U.S. users of steel. And they're the ones that get left out. And I'll say in a little while why they get left out. But now, by the way, when Alan Dalton asked me to recommend somebody give a talk on trade, I said he should get Doug Irwin. That's the guy he should have got. He wasn't available, so he said, who else? I said, me. And if he'd said no to me, I would have said Don Boudreaux. This is from Don Boudreaux, and I couldn't resist. Because this is how real wars would be fought if they're fought like trade wars. Leader of Absurditopia. I say, leader of Stupidia, we demand that you stop occupying that contested strip of land. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to shoot our own citizens. Leader of Stupidia, you don't scare us, that land is ours. And if you do kill some of your own people, make no mistake that we will immediately commence to killing our own people. Absurditopia, ha, you're bluffing, but I'm not. I've just ordered my troops to kill 10% of my fellow countrymen. Take that. And so on. I think you get the point. I was on BBC talking about this. There was a guy named Gary Cohn who was in the Trump administration, and he was the one kind of heading off most of the restrictions on trade. And when he quit, the BBC called me and asked me, what I thought. And I said, well, there might be a trade war because the French might be as stupid as our government is. And it turns out there is something to that. Now, just to kind of put in context what trade is like technology. You often hear that we've lost X number of jobs in manufacturing due to trade. It turns out we've lost way more jobs in manufacturing due to improvements in technology. We now produce 5 times the number of tons of steel per worker that we did in 1960. We produce roughly 5 times the number of cars per auto worker that we did in 1960. Technology has improved productivity. So that's the main reason for the decline in those jobs. Trade is actually less important. And I just want to show you some data on this. Oh, but before I do, I want to tell this little parable that's in a book on international trade. This company on the coast of North Carolina announces that they've got this new technology that's tremendous. It's very productive. They take in these raw material inputs and out pop these outputs that are cheaper than those of their competitors. TVs, refrigerators, stoves, and people are really excited about this. This is wonderful. What a great company. They're producing things and making prices lower. And they get a lot of good press. There is some grumbling because some of the other companies, some of the workers have lost jobs, but overall, people are very happy. And then one day, a 14-year-old boy goes out with his snorkel and goes underwater right by the plant. And he sees that all this is not a manufacturing enterprise at all. All it is a gigantic export-import firm. They're taking all those raw materials, they're putting them on a boat, they're shipping them to Japan, and back come these things. And of course, what gets written up? What a horrible company this is. Maybe it's a little horrible for lying, but what they did was exactly the same as if it had been technology. They found a cheaper way of turning raw materials into final goods. Now, let me show you what's happened to employees in manufacturing. The left time is on the year is on the horizontal axis. Thousands of workers, employees, is on the vertical axis, and it starts out in 1940. We peaked in about 1978, and notice we've come way down to where we now have approximately 12.5 million people in manufacturing, and we had something like 19 million in 1980. So there is that loss of manufacturing jobs. And notice that's in an economy with roughly 50% more workers than in 1980. And that's what people are sometimes getting at. But now, look at the next graph. Oh, sorry, and this really drives it home, and then I'm going to get to the next graph. The percent of employment in manufacturing in the United States has plummeted. In 1970, it was over 26%, and now it's just over 10%. But now, look at manufacturing output, and this is in real terms. This is adjusted for inflation. It's close to an all-time high. So there's this myth out there that we're losing manufacturing, and we're really not. There's another myth, and well, it's a true factual statement, but it's misleading. And the true factual statement is that the middle class is disappearing. Yes, the U.S. middle class is shrinking. Look at the left graph. That starts in 67 and goes to 2016. And it gives the percent of households with 35,000 to 100,000 in family income, and that's adjusted for inflation. And notice that it fell from 53.2% to 42.1% over about 40 years. But now, if you go to the right-hand side, we've got the same graph, but we've added some bars. Look at the dark blue. Those are the percent of households with more than $100,000 in real income. That went from 8.1% to 27.7%. Look at below that, people with less than 35,000. That went from 38.7% to 30.2%. So the middle class is shrinking. It's shrinking up. We are doing generally very well. Now, one of the ways to think about trade is to think about what you would do without trade. Well, here's my little story about what how would I do. I get imports from China, a TV. Canada, coffee crisps. If you haven't ever tried a coffee crisp candy bar, you're depriving yourself. From Mexico, avocados. From Japan, car parts. From Korea, a cell phone. From Saudi Arabia, gasoline. From France, wine. From India, and increasingly Bangladesh, a shirt. So that's a pretty big deal. Nevertheless, there are pressures for protectionism, and I want to say more about that. First of all, protectionism should really be called barrierism. Protection's a good thing, right? I used to teach military officers. I want to be protected. But what are we protecting ourselves from? Imports, low prices. It should really be called barrierism. It essentially reverses the gains from exchange by limiting exchange. There was a famous French economist and economic journalist in the first half of the 19th century named Frédéric Bastiat. Who's heard of Frédéric Bastiat? Okay. Bastiat was an amazing writer, and if I recommend it, just go and Google what is seen and what is not seen and read it, and you'll learn a ton of economics in 40 minutes. And I know, I used to talk about Bastiat in my class, and I know it kind of took hold. You know, I'd talk about my first or second day of class, because if I was going across the quadrangle at the Naval Postgraduate School, and I saw a bunch of students huddled, and one of them looked up, I'd hear one of them whisper, "There goes that Bastiat." Or at least it sounded something like that. And Bastiat said, tariffs are like a negative railroad. I mean, think about a railroad makes it easy to trade between two places, brings down the cost of transportation. Tariffs are like blowing up the railroad, making it harder. There was another, there are two other analogies, and one of them, by the way, was Ronald Reagan when he was president. And I couldn't find this in any other publication. So people had this idea that Ronald Reagan was this kind of dumb guy. I certainly didn't see that. And here was his analogy with protectionism, with restrictions on trade. He said, let's say you're on a lifeboat with someone out in the middle of the ocean, and that person shoots a hole in the boat. You're upset about that. He hurt you. Is your best strategy to shoot another hole in the boat? Well, that's like restrictions on trade. There was a famous left-wing economist named Joan Robinson, and hers was similar to Reagan's. She said that, let's say your trading partner puts boulders in his harbor that makes it harder for the ships to get there. Should you respond by putting boulders in your harbor? No, that makes no sense. And then there was a famous economist of the late 19th century named Henry George, who wrote a whole book on free trade and protectionism. And here's what he said. Protectionism teaches us to do to ourselves in time of peace what enemies seek to do to us in time of war. Right? I mean, think about Churchill trying to starve Germany, and unfortunately, in my view, successfully, during the First World War. He tried to prevent trade with Germany. Well, that was a warlike measure. What do governments do when they try to prevent us from buying goods? They act like Churchill acted to the Germans. And then, since I'm such a fan of Bastiat, I want to quote his famous Petition of the Candle Makers. We candle makers are suffering from the unfair competition of a foreign rival. This foreign manufacturer of light has such an advantage over us that he floods our domestic markets with his product, and he offers it at a fantastically low price. The moment this foreigner appears in our country, all our customers desert us and turn to him. As a result, an entire domestic industry is rendered completely stagnant. And even more, since the lighting industry has countless ramifications with other native industries, they too are injured. This foreign manufacturer who competes against us without mercy is none other than the sun. Again, if you're, it's great that you're laughing, because if you're laughing, you're getting the point about trade and protectionism. Now, one issue that comes up, and I think there's been a lot of misinformation on both sides, and that is the question, does trade create jobs? And the answer is no, not on net. It doesn't create them, and it doesn't destroy them. What it does is it shifts them. So when trade opens up, people in a country start producing things that they have a comparative advantage in and not doing those other things, so their jobs gained in one industry and lost in another. And so let me give an example from trade. Trade really got going in the 70s and 80s. And on the left, I've given declining industries in the United States, in steel mills, textiles, apparel, shoes, radios, TVs, tires, but then look at the jobs gained. Computer equipment, medical instruments, communications equipment, aerospace, oil field machinery, biological products. So there's no net gain or loss in jobs, but what you have is people doing their comparative advantage, and therefore there's more overall product. And now let me look at what some economists have estimated are the costs of trying to save jobs in particular industries. Specialty steel, a total of 520 jobs saved, cost per job saved $1 million. And those workers weren't getting paid $1 million. That's a huge cost to consumers to give a small help to workers and the companies. Carbon steel, $750,000, and so on. Work your way down. And then in 2011, President Obama restricted sales of Chinese tires. And in his State of the Union, he bragged about the number of jobs saved. Don't brag, Mr. President. He said over 1,000 Americans are working today because we stopped a surge in Chinese tires. That was actually a pretty good estimate. So that was 1,000 jobs saved. What did that cost? The cost increase on non-Chinese imports. They replaced some of the Chinese imports, but they were a little more expensive. If they hadn't been more expensive, we would have already been buying them. $817 million. Cost increase on U.S.-made tires, $295 million. Overall, $1.1 billion. Cost per tire job saved, $926,500. During the 2012 debate between President Obama and Romney, he bragged about that, and I'm just going, Romney, go for it. He didn't. I also want to quote briefly, very briefly, one word from a book called Travels of a T-Shirt in the Global Economy. Anyone here read that? This woman, this economist, traces where T-shirts get made and all the inputs and so on. She follows them around the world. And she goes to China and sees all these things being made. And then, and she asks all these questions. And she asks this guy where he gets his cotton. And he goes, Texas. She goes, what? He goes, Texas. Show me on the map. So he pulls out a map of the United States and shows her Texas. The cotton was made in Texas. So comparative advantage, it's very hard to predict, but that's what's so great about the market. Relative prices lead people to make certain decisions, and we don't need a central planner to do it. And in fact, a central planner will virtually always screw up because they don't have enough information and they don't have the right incentives. We also sometimes hear that it's a good idea to buy American. Now, I actually don't believe that. In fact, let me just tell you, my wife and I were shopping for a dining room table, a nice wooden dining room table. And we looked at this table and looked kind of good, and the woman says, and it's made in the United States. And I just said, is that good or bad? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know where. And she got really pissed off at me. Like, I want the best table. I don't care where it's made. But anyway, it was a good table. We bought it. Okay. Buy American. Which is the American car and which is an import? On the top we got the Ford Mustang. On the bottom we got the Toyota Camry. Well, let's see. The Ford Mustang is 65% domestic. The Toyota Camry is 80% domestic. There's no such thing as an American car. There's no such thing as a Japanese car. It's a world car. And that's what you get when you have this incredibly extensive division of labor. Now, when we talk about trade, economists tend to talk about, oops, is that where I want to go? Economists tend to talk about two people, two goods in a desert island, and that's kind of like my thing in the desert with the water and so on. But there's a way in which the analogy breaks down when we have a much greater number of people, and I want to talk about that for a minute. It's called dispersed gainers and concentrated losers. So, actually, I should have labeled that dispersed losers, concentrated gainers, because this is a restriction on trade. We have some of the tightest import quotas on sugar of any country in the world. As a result, our price of sugar is roughly double the world price. That's why Lifesavers, which has sugar as a major import, moved from Michigan to Quebec a few years ago because they can get a cheaper import, a cheaper input, sugar. Anyone here tried Coca-Cola from Mexico? You like it better? Why? It has sucrose. It has sugar. What do we have with Coca-Cola made here? Corn syrup. It's pretty good, but it's not there. And in taste tests, this young economist did an experiment with his kids with Mexican Coke and California Coke, and he titled it The Taste of Protectionism, his write-up on it, and they could taste the difference. Now, okay, so sugar import quotas are behind that. Agricultural economists estimate the annual loss to consumers is $1.9 billion. That's 300 million consumers paying about $6 more each. The gain to producers is $1 billion. Is that an efficient subsidy? Or is that an efficient transfer? Cost $1.9 billion for $1 billion in benefits. But a handful of producers gain tens of millions of dollars each. So, why does that happen? Look at those numbers again. Let me ask you, who here has ever written a letter to his or her member of Congress complaining about quotas on sugar? Raise your hand. And my hand's not up either. And I know this. Okay, when the issue gets debated in Congress, if it ever does get debated, do you think sugar producers are aware of those facts in doing something about it? Oh, yes. Because some of them have tens of millions of dollars at stake. So because even though the losses to consumers outweigh the gains to producers, the losses are dispersed among hundreds of millions of us, and the gains are concentrated among a handful of producers and a few thousand workers. And therefore, the handful of producers and the few thousand workers have a very loud voice in that discussion. The consumers don't even have a whisper. And that's why we get what we get. Now, that's all. Well, actually, I'm going to get to some good news soon. One more piece, though, to get to, because we often hear about this. What about dumping? Now, different people define dumping differently. Sometimes it means a foreign producer selling something here at a low price. Low compared to what? There are two definitions. One is low compared to the price at which they're selling to people in other countries, including their own, or it's sometimes low price compared to an estimate of average cost, and different definitions are used. Okay, you know what I say as an economist if another country wants to engage in dumping? Dump away! What's that mean? It's a low price. So Fred Smith of the Comparative Enterprise Institute said the following: if the U.S. government treated U.S. producers the way it treats foreign producers, every after-Christmas sale would be banned. Often what you have is you have them selling at a low price because they want to get rid of the item or whatever, and so you can't always take the actual historical cost as being the real cost. Okay, now I want to just show you, as you probably can tell, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump's views on trade and tariffs, but it is bipartisan. So I want to show you another guy who's kind of a villain in the piece, and I want to have you try to identify whether he's the one on the left or the right. On the left we have Senator Robert Byrd, on the right we have Sam the Eagle. And Doug Irwin shared this slide with me, the guy who would have come here. And why? Byrd slipped into some 2000 legislation, and then they tried to bring it back. A little thing, a little piece of protectionism. And let me read it out. It was called the Birt Amendment. And here's what it did. Instead of sicking the U.S. government on foreign companies to collect punitive duties for the Treasury on people who are dumping, it gave the tariff money directly to the companies that filed the complaints. What a sweet deal. As of 2007, some $1.9 billion had been handed out to thousands of supplicants, from beekeepers to steel manufacturers. The lion's share had gone to big business. And anyway, it threatened to expire. The World Trade Organization ruled the Birt Amendment illegal, and then he fought to revive it. And so, oh my goodness. This is from the New York Times, and honest, I didn't read to the end of the thing, but let me read you a paragraph. Even with all this evidence on their side, Byrd opponents are worried, the people who don't want this. Although Senator Larry Craig, Republican Idaho, who brags on his website about steering Byrd money to Micron, will soon retire, other Republicans are on board with many Democrats. Didn't plan that, but I felt like I should say that anyway. Okay, now let me show you some really good news, because if you look at the lecture from now, I think there are two things you've probably got if you look at big picture. One is trade is really good. Trade helps us produce according to our comparative advantage. The other is there's this bias in the political system in favor of protectionism. So if you just think that way, you might think, well, the protectionists are winning. In the short run, they are. The great news is in the long run, they're losing. And let me show you this data. This is average tariffs after World War II for industrialized countries. 1940, over 40%, and it comes down, down, down to where in 2000, it's about 2.5%. Even China, which has higher tariffs than us, their average tariff rate is under 10% now. We have among the lowest tariff rates, but we don't have the lowest. Canada is slightly lower, for example. But the point is, tariff rates have come down a lot around the world, and so we've gotten most of the gains we can get from trade. Well, what about this thing called the trade deficit? You've probably heard about that. And the technical term is the merchandise trade deficit. What it is the difference between the amount of goods we sell versus the amount of goods we buy. And that is a pretty high number in some years. So let me take the last year before the last recession really got going, late in that year, 2007. U.S. exports of goods were 1.16 trillion. U.S. imports 1.984 trillion. Merchandise trade deficit was 823 billion. That was a large number. Now, we did have a surplus on services. Exports of 488 billion, imports of 376, surplus of services 121. So the U.S. deficit on goods and services was 702 billion. Then we had a really bad recession, started late in 2007, went through 2008, ended early in 2009, but still we were close to the depths in 2009. And I want to just ask you, if you think a trade deficit is a bad idea, then you want it to be lower, right? Okay. Let's look at 2009. U.S. exports, 1,069 billion. U.S. imports, 1,575 billion. Merchandise trade deficit, 507 billion. We had a surplus in services. We had a deficit in goods and services of only 375 billion. Compared to what? Compared to 702. So we cut it roughly in half. Why? Because we were in a recession. The easiest way to reduce the most straightforward way to reduce our trade deficit is to have a recession. Is it worth it? I don't think so. Now, then the question is, where does it go? So when Trump talks about this, he says, we lost 800 billion. No, we got $800 billion more worth of goods than we sold. We didn't lose 800 billion, we gained cars, right? Well, then the question though is, where did that 800 billion go? And it went to a few things. A lot of them take that money and buy U.S. bonds. A lot of them take it and buy U.S. stocks. A lot of them invest it directly in companies here. And some of it, not a huge amount, but say 20 to 30 billion a year, is just held as cash. Benjamins, $100 bills. Now, is that a good deal for us? That's a fantastic deal for us. Do you know what it costs the U.S. government to print a $100 bill? 25 cents. So they can produce something for 25 cents and someone in another country wants to hold it. That is a great deal. It's like that old Jay Leno ad for Doritos back in 1987. Go ahead and eat them. We'll make more. Right? Now, and one other thing I want to mention. Does anyone remember who ran against George H.W. Bush in 1988? Michael Dukakis. So I wrote this up recently in an article. Dukakis was in a suburb of St. Louis, and he was talking about what a horrible idea it was for people to have to go back to direct investment. That's where people in other countries own companies here. And he was talking to these workers about what a horrible idea it was for Americans to have to work for a foreign employer. Do you want to do that? And these employees are looking around like, what? And what he didn't know, he hadn't been really told very, very accurately, was that he was talking to employees of a company of a foreign employer of a foreign company. He was talking to people who were working for a foreign company and they hadn't seen any big deal. So there are these huge gains from trade, and there's another gain. It's kind of like the cherry on the ice cream sundae, and that is peace. I wear another hat sometimes. I'm the co-chair in Monterey of an organization called Libertarians for Peace. And we've been against pretty much every war there's been in this century and most of the last one. And you can tell we've been very successful. But I'll tell you, in a way, we haven't been successful, but the world has been successful. Because if you look at how peaceful the world is now, it's actually, if you look at, say, number of people killed in wars, it's actually pretty low compared to historically. And so trade promotes peace. There was a famous French philosopher named Montesquieu, whom the founding fathers read when they were thinking about the Constitution. And he said, peace is the natural effect of trade. There's another guy named Otto T. Mallory, a State Department bureaucrat, who said, when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. Now, you're going to tell me it was Bastiat who said it, but he didn't. I tend to check my facts when I give talks, and everyone thinks he said it. He should have said it, but he didn't. It was this guy. And so these political scientists, we economists like measuring things, they actually measured it. An economist named Solomon Polachek and a political scientist named Carlos Sigli. And what's above is my wording of what they found. The higher the gains from trade between two trading partners, the lower the level of conflict between them. A doubling of trade leads to a 20% decrease in belligerence. In short, trading nations cooperate more and fight less. I was in a cab in Washington when there was a lot of tension between Pakistan and India. And there often is tension between those two countries. And the cab driver was Pakistani. So I said, are you worried? He said, oh, no, I'm not worried at all. There's so much trade between those two countries than there was, say, 20 years ago. And I felt like saying, teach me some economics, buddy. So yeah, that's the little cherry on the sundae. So let me just sum up I want to sum up, and then I want to just say something to the undergrads in the audience. But let me just sum up first. Just as trade between people in a city or in a state or in a country makes sense and makes pretty much everyone better off, so it's true that trade across borders makes sense. There's no magic. There's nothing about borders that means that trade doesn't make sense or we suddenly lose. And I hope that whatever I've done, I've persuaded you of that. Thank you. And when I give a talk where there are a lot of undergrads in the audience, or even high school students, I like to take 3 to 4 minutes to talk about your futures. So who here, raise your hand if you're a junior or a senior in college. Okay. So a lot of you are thinking about, what are you going to do next? And if you've performed well, gotten A's and B's, there's a temptation to just go on in education. So I've heard students say, I don't know what I'm going to do, so I'll go to graduate school. Or, I don't know what I'm going to do, so I'll go to law school. Or sometimes, I don't know what I'll do, so I'll get an MBA. That could work out, but if that's your reason, there's a reasonable chance it won't work out. Here's why. Let's say you do one of those 3 things, and you succeed. You get a PhD, a master's or PhD, you get an MBA, or you get an LLD. And then you start practicing in your field for a few years, and you find you don't like it. And now you're like 32, and you kind of wanted to have a family. And maybe you can, and maybe you can switch. And the great thing about how wealthy a country we are is you can switch. But it's a lot harder to do that switch at age 32 than to spend a year or two at age 22 thinking about what you want to do. So a better strategy, I think, is to go do an internship somewhere. Go try something, read about something, talk to people in your area. I mean, I never was tempted to be a doctor, but if I had been, my first trip into the hospital would have talked me out of it, like I would have fainted when I saw the first bit of blood. My nephew, who was a student, a fairly well-performing student at University of Southern California, at UCLA, we called it University of Second Choice. But anyway, he wanted to be a lawyer. And I said to him, Greg, tell me why. And he couldn't. And I said, well, go to a law firm and try to volunteer for just 2 weeks and see what happens. Well, he never did. But also, because he couldn't tell me why, he didn't. And he just sold his company for a couple $1 million doing software. Okay? So that's one anecdote, but still, it makes the point. Who here is a freshman or a sophomore? Okay. My little bit of advice there is, and you kind of learn this, but it's probably good to make it explicit. When you're trying to decide which courses to take the professor, not the course. You can find a course that looks really interesting in the catalog, and a bad professor can make it awful. You can find something that doesn't look interesting, but you've heard great things about this professor, and that professor can get you really jazzed. And by the way, I don't mean take an easy A. That's not what I mean at all. Who here is from high school? Okay, that last little bit of advice is relevant to you, right? When you get there, don't go for the easy A's. Or if you're going to go, think on the margin. If you're going to go for easy A's, go for one easy A and do the other 3 or 4 that are more interesting. But look around and find who the professors are who are teaching stuff that's interesting rather than looking in the catalog for an interesting course. Okay, that's Milton Freeman was one of my mentors. I never took a course under him. But I'd write letters to him telling me my plans in my life, and he would usually say, that's a bad plan. And he once called himself my Dutch uncle. And I said, what's that? And he goes, well, it's not really your uncle, but I kind of care about you. So that was David Henderson being Dutch uncle here. Okay, Q&A, questions?
Speak into it.
Bye. Oh. Oh, yeah. Tell you what, let's give them half a minute. What? Yeah, right.
No questions on that side?
Stack them.
All right. Okay, no, we got another one. There we go.
Sir, if you have a loud enough voice, I think we can start.
I can try my best.
Get closer to the microphone.
All right, I guess I'm not loud enough.
Yep.
But in any case, okay. So, if free trade supposedly promotes peace, and you don't necessarily care where your table is made, so national camaraderie is not necessarily something up your alley, and if government is typically seen as something that promotes peace and a sense of identity, what is your vision of government?
I don't share the premise. In other words, I don't see governments as necessarily promoting peace, and I don't think it's proper for them to promote any sense of identity. I think our sense of identity comes from who we are and our connections with people. So I don't share that premise. But I can tell you what government is in a literal technical sense. government is a monopoly on the use of force. That's what government is. And that gets back to the Stephen Carter quote. Don't advocate a law unless you're willing to use violence to enforce it.
Is that right? Okay.
Quick follow-up?
Yeah, so if it is, so like, I guess my question is just for what, in your opinion? If it's not for security, it's not for identity, what is government for? Or is it just an irrational monopoly that exists and we can't do anything about it?
Okay. Different people have different goals for government. So it's not for one thing. Some people want to use it for something, some people want to use it for other things. What I can say is I think there's been way too much trust in government, even in this country. And government, a lot of politicians play on our fears and get us to be kind of against each other based on certain things. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess we're going to go back and forth. Sir? Oh, and I forgot to ask the other, could you say your name?
Hi, my name's Justin.
Justin, hi.
So I was wondering, are you a supporter of a free trade deal or just no trade deal at all?
If I could have my druthers, I would have no trade deal. I would just have completely free trade between all countries. However, the way we have gotten to free trade has typically been with trade deals. So I hope this still works. I don't know if they cut me off or... Oh, they cut me off. Remember that graph I showed with those tariff rates falling? It was right at the end of the talk. Oh, that was due to trade deals. That was, look at what it says on the right, the Geneva round, the NNC, which I can't pronounce, Torquay, Geneva, the Dillon, the Kennedy, the Tokyo, the Uruguay. Those were all a whole bunch of countries getting together, governments getting together and negotiating those things. So the way it worked in practice was you did have governments doing it. The two countries that didn't do it that way and did very well as a result were Hong Kong and Singapore. No trade deals, just free trade with everyone. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, sir, thank you for being here. I think we've all enjoyed it a ton.
Thank you. What's
so
your
my
name?
question is this.
What's your name?
Noah.
Noah.
Yeah,
Hi.
I'm an international business student.
Okay.
So my question is this. Many people believe that China was able to enter the World Trade Organization unfairly because of the failing of the Chinese government to remove heavy subsidization from the government to Chinese companies. Do you believe that there can be an argument made for the validity of the U.S. and China trade war from a free trade perspective because of this?
No. And let me say why. Just as dumping benefits us, so do Chinese subsidies to their own companies benefit us. To the extent they subsidize them on exports, we get cheaper imports. Now, I do think it's incredibly unjust. Who's it unjust to? Chinese citizens. That's who it's unjust to. They're being taxed to pay for that. But I don't think it's unjust to us, and I don't think that justifies a trade war.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir. What's your name?
Sorry, George.
George, hi.
Hi. Appreciate you being here. Thank you. Do you think that China recognizes the disadvantages of tariffs? And second part, do you think that Donald Trump intends to keep tariffs on, or is he just using this as an art of the deal ploy to get, because he has said, I would prefer no tariffs at all.
Right. So the first question, do I think they recognize the problem with tariffs? They definitely recognize the problem with U.S. tariffs. I'm not convinced they recognize the problem with Chinese tariffs. So Deng Xiaoping, when he deregulated that economy, that's why they had hundreds of millions of people move into the middle class. Xi, however you say it, XI, Mr. XI, wants more of an industrial policy. And an industrial policy typically doesn't work. A government isn't good at choosing winners, so he's kind of reversing things. Now, he's not going back to Mao, fortunately. It's not even close to what Mao did, where he murdered tens of millions of people. but it's nevertheless a step in the wrong direction. So someone who believes in that as a separate issue from tariffs probably wants, it's one or two possibilities. He doesn't understand these economic issues, or it's a way of having power over people. And so even if there's an economic loss, it gives him more power over Chinese people. So that's the first one.
All right.
The second one was,
Trade ploy.
oh yeah, about Trump's motives. I'm not sure. Some days I think he wants it as just a bargaining device and he wants no tariffs. Other times, I don't think that. Now, it is true, a good bargainer would make you think he wants tariffs forever, right? So he might be lying to us as well as the Chinese. That's possible. I just don't know.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Welcome.
My name's Sam.
Hi, Sam.
So I wonder if you think that economists bear some of the responsibility for why free trade has gotten a bad rap, because there's a certain sense in which the classic case for free trade, which you've made very lucidly, can come off as somewhat glib. Because while it's true that trade between two countries makes people in those countries better off, it doesn't seem guaranteed that literally everyone will be made better off. And this has been known for quite a while, but there's some interesting research by economists like David Autor
Right.
And others. And whatever you think about his research, he finds that displaced American workers who are in industries that are competing with China oftentimes find it very difficult to even make the same amount of money that they were making in the factories that they no longer work at, even years later.
Right.
So I wonder if the defense of free trade could be improved by economists by conceding that, yeah, free trade is on the whole beneficial, but there's going to be some struggle, some difficulties. And if you think there's any, what should be done with those workers
Okay.
who are displaced?
Okay.
I don't know if that made any sense.
No, it made total sense.
Okay.
So what Sam is talking about, there was an economist at MIT named David Autor, A-U-T-O-R, who did this study, and I'm not enough of an econometrician to challenge the study, and basically finding that in areas where China was allowed into the WTO in 2000, and within a few years their imports penetrated in a lot of places. And what economists tended to expect is, okay, where those imports penetrate, those people lose their jobs and they go elsewhere and find other jobs. And many of them did, but what Autor and his co-authors point out is many of them did not. And so 10 years later, they're worse off than they were 10 years ago. And I agree. I think some economists have been too glib, and I've always admitted that. I've never said it'd be an easy transition. But what I always want to go back to is trade in general. So yes, they were clearly worse off due to that trade. But were they worse off due to trade? So then I want to look at all the bundle of goods they buy. I mean, coffee, right? Let's say we insisted on having coffee just produced in the United States. We'd have Hawaii, and we'd have a lot of hot houses, and we'd have coffee that's 2 to 3 times the price. Bananas, similarly, and just go down the list. So I'm fairly confident that even those unemployed workers are better off with trade than without trade. And so that's how I would pitch it. There's this economist, and I was going to say he's a friend of mine, but I can't remember his name, so I don't know how that, but I'm picturing his book in the library, and his name starts with M, and he's in Pennsylvania. And we were talking one day because he goes to Pennsylvania steelworkers and makes the case for free trade. And he told me that he'll ask his audience, and his audience of steelworkers is often like 55 years old. And he says, who wants to keep your job for another 5 years? And almost all of them put up their hand. And then he says, who wants your son to have your job? And none of them put up their hand. So it's this little transition time. And if I were a person who trusted government to do things right, I might want some kind of adjustment assistance, but they screw up on that too. And so I don't have a really good solution. Well, I do to some extent, make it easy for them to move, make it easy. So, for example, occupational licensing laws. There are 800 occupations in the United States now where you need a license of some sort of government permission to practice. So when they go to another state, they sometimes have to start from scratch. Make that easier. And Arizona, by the way, just passed a law, their governor signed it a few months ago, saying that if you're licensed in any of these other states and you don't have a criminal record, you come here and you're automatically licensed. And I think we should see more of that. Sir, what's your name?
My name is Greg.
Greg.
And I was wondering if you would clarify your comment about making more Doritos in relationship to money. I mean, I'm trusting that you weren't implying printing more money.
Yes, I was.
Okay.
And the big difference is we get way less of a profit margin on Doritos than we get on money. Because if someone holds that money in another country, and why would they hold it? Because the US dollar is still a substantial store of value. And they hold it for that reason. And so if they want to hold 20 billion more, and that's a kind of a reasonable number in a year, and so that money leaves circulation here, and then we're worried about deflation, have the government print more.
Okay. So it just kind of violates that notion that I think a lot of us have been taught about: the more you print, the lower the value.
All other things equal. But what's not equal is the amount of money in circulation. It's just making up for the money that left.
But eventually that money that left will come back in order for it to have some purchasing value later, would it not?
But that's why I said a store of value. It doesn't necessarily have to come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Sir.
So I wanted to talk about...
What's your name?
Jordan, sorry.
Jordan.
I wanted to talk about your argument about comparative advantage.
Yes.
A lot of new trade theorists tend to posit that protectionism in infant industries can create a comparative advantage for countries that have those industries. The argument often comes up with companies like Toyota in Japan. In a world with no protectionism, how do you posit that comparative advantage comes about?
It comes about due to the relative costs of producing in that country. So you can't predict which industry for a government to invest in. My first article for Fortune was The Myth of MEATY. MEATY was the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And there were people in the early 80s saying the reason the Japanese economy is doing so well is that MEATY planned its economy so well. And let me see if I can say almost word for word the first two paragraphs. In 1953, a small consumer electronics company applied to MEATY, the Ministry of International Trade Industry, for permission to buy $25,000 in U.S. foreign exchange in order to buy a technology from Western Electric in the United States. The permission was needed because the Japanese had exchange controls. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry turned them down. They persisted, and 2 years later were able to buy that technology. The name of the consumer electronics firm, Sony. So there you have MEATY saying no to this company that wants to establish a comparative advantage. Second paragraph. In the mid-1950s, the Ministry of International Trade and Industry tried to have a national competition to figure out one type of a product that should be produced, and then all the companies should produce that same product. The companies rebuffed the Ministry of International Trade and Industry and went on to produce each of them their own product. The industry, autos. So there you have MEATY trying to say, we need one auto company producing one kind of car, and they said no. So when I look at Japan, I see MEATY messing things up and people persisting in spite of it. So no, I don't see that that's true. And I think you way overstated when you said there are these new trade economists who say, well, you did say it can happen. That was your verb. Yeah, it can, and it doesn't. Sir, what's your name?
My name is Peter. I'm a senior business major. And I have a question. The New York Post posted an article 4 hours ago talking about how strong the economy is.
Yeah.
The Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ set new records today. Unemployment is at its all-time low in over 50 years at 3.6% and shrinking. So I'm curious, you talked a lot about Trump's economic policies.
Yeah.
What would you say? You said that protectionism harms both parties,
Yeah.
which I think we can agree to some extent.
Yeah.
In the short term, it might. So what would you then say is the cause of our strongest economy in decades?
Good question. And first of all, you got the data almost exactly right. I mean, it's not the lowest. It was 3.6, or 3.5 the previous month, but that's a quibble, right? It's very low. It hasn't been this low since December 1969. And it's not because people are leaving the labor force, they are entering the labor force. This is really good news.
Right.
Real wages are rising, the stock market all-time high. All true. I write a piece every 2 weeks for Hoover for their online publication, Defining Ideas. And I wrote a 2-part series on Donald Trump's economic policy. And I led with the following poem that I made up, but I think you'll recognize the original source. There was a president with an orange curl on his forehead. When he was good, he was very good indeed. When he was bad, he was horrid. And so the part 1 was the very good indeed, which were the tax cut. And the more I look at the tax cut, the more clever I think it was as a good economic policy. And substantial deregulation. That's the good. And the bad is his policies on trade, on immigration, and on government spending. And I just think the good so far has outweighed the bad.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
Hi, my name's Benjamin.
Ben Olson?
That's me. Great memory. Wow, thanks. I'm so blessed to have you here. So,
thank you.
Yeah, don't touch it. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, thank you for coming. I used to live in Douala, Cameroon, which is a big port city on the west coast of Africa. And I lived on a ship, and we would see huge old-growth forest often just on its way to be shipped off to countries, mostly China. Sometimes Europe, Germany, I think, was buying a lot of this old-growth forest.
Right.
And I was, as a free market economist, I studied economics in undergrad, was trying to wrap my mind around how trade benefits all parties when it feels like a corrupt government is taking the resources from its people in exchange for the wealth that the Chinese have to offer. So I'm just wondering, how can you help me think about trade making all parties best off?
Okay, got it.
In like that kind of a international superiority situation when China has all of the bidding power and these developing countries have such corrupt governments.
Right, and I think it's more the latter than the former. In other words, I think it's more the corrupt government than China having bargaining power, because someone from here could have bought that stuff too. So what I said was both sides gain from exchange, and what that means is the buyer and the seller gain. Now what you're pointing out is the seller may be incredibly corrupt. So even though he, in this case that government, gains, that doesn't necessarily help those other people, and I think that's right. And I don't know enough about the specifics to say more, but I do know that, I mean, taking an easy example, if someone here steals a car and sells it, he gains from the exchange, but that doesn't mean that that was a good idea or that the person who had the car stolen is better off. They aren't.
Right. Thanks.
Thanks.
I'm Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I wanted to know your thoughts on when, what would you propose when China steals intellectual property often? How can someone put pressure, or country or government put pressure on them to stop, or how would you propose trying to resolve that?
Good question. In my second article, the part 2 about the horrid, when I talked about Trump's trade policies, I did say that one of the arguments he makes is tariffs against China until they start respecting intellectual property more. So even though I think he's playing an incredibly dangerous game, and I think the odds that he wins are well below 50%, you can make a respectable argument for that strategy. Here's what doesn't make sense. There is an organization within the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that deals with complaints about intellectual property. And it's had successes over the year. And this committee on the WTO needs a quorum. There are 7 members when they're up to full staff. They need a quorum. After December 10th, in other words, after 5 weeks from now, there'll be 1 member of the WTO, and they won't be able to do anything. And who's blocking new members of this committee? Donald Trump. So he's not working within the current system to the extent he could. So that's the first point I'd make. The second point is that I gave a talk to another group a couple of weeks ago, and that issue came up. And this person who knows a lot about it, has dealt with American companies, said that the Chinese government insists that when an American company locates there, they have to turn over the rights to their intellectual property. And that's bad. There's no doubt that's bad when a government steps in and says you have to do that. I don't think that's quite the same as theft, though, because the American company is entering that with its eyes open. It's saying, well, we don't like that, but it's still better for us to be practicing China with that constraint than not. In a sense, it's not different in principle from a Chinese company locating here and the government saying you have to collect Social Security taxes and turn them over to the government. And they might not want to do it, but that's the deal. The third point is, do you know what one of the biggest violators of what country was one of the biggest violators of intellectual property in the 19th century? You're sitting in it. It was the United States. And the British were very upset at the theft of patents and copyrights and so on. And so I'm not justifying it. I do think that it happens, and it'd be nice if it didn't happen. I don't think that's enough to justify these tariffs. Sir.
I'm David, and I have a question about all of these newsletter writers talking so much about gold. And
gold?
Gold, yeah. And I think that what you've said about about money makes more sense, but I'd like to hear your comment about those who say that gold and silver are this great store of value.
Okay, so I think they're not, but I can imagine states of the world in which you should have a little gold. So if the whole thing just went horrible, you know. So in my state, the government is going along with our utility cutting off power to millions of people. So let's say that continued to happen. You could imagine that state going very bad. And there might be some little bit of gold you would want. When I do a calculation on my net worth, I think 0.5% of my net worth is in gold coins. So I've got a little. But no, I don't think it's too risky a store of value. It can go up and down, and it does. But I think it makes sense to have a little in your portfolio. Hi.
I'm hoping you're enjoying Boise. My name is Sergio, and I'm going to be asking...
Serafino?
Sergio. And I'm going to be asking...
How do you spell?
Sergio.
Sergio.
And I'm going to be asking a question divided into 2 parts. So part 1 is that you made the example between the 12-year-old making shirts, making shoes, and us here. And then we go into the philosophical manners of ethics. if 12-year-olds working in the industry will truly be in a beneficial way toward the economy, then why did countries like England or then the organic economy in the United States, by the early 20th centuries, most of the state outlaw child labor? And part B is that you talk about gains just in the material manner of what's better off, and I understand this is a modern Lockean philosophy that later involves through Rousseau, but in the classical philosophy there is higher end that is the ordination of the human soul, and can we not make the argument that trade actually hurts a country by ordaining the human soul, by allowing people to have access to a higher amount of goods that they might seem unnecessary, and then make them inefficient toward the path towards a higher goal than economical, how you say, the higher GDP, there's something beyond that.
Got it. Okay, so on your first question, one of the major people in Britain who tried to get rid of child labor was a guy named Lord Shaftesbury. And well, let me tell you the economic facts before I get to him and what he said. So, in the 19th century and before the 19th century, children were not thought of as consumption goods. They were thought of as production goods. In other words, you had kids because you needed them to support the family. And by the way, you knew that most of them would die. So Gibbons, what was his first name, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire? What was? Edward Gibbons had 6 brothers named Edward. Why? No, don't tell me George Foreman. I know that story. It was because his parents figured that most of them would die, okay, and they needed kids to carry on. What happened was, as living standards got better, people could do without the work of children, and children turned from production goods into consumption goods. They're very expensive consumption goods, by the way. And so that's when they started wanting them to send them to school. So when Shaftesbury comes along, a huge amount of this transition has already happened. And that's what you'll notice often with these laws. They come along, and the only way they can come along is with the majority, is if the majority of people are already doing what the law says they should do. So when we got the 48-hour week, most companies had the 48-hour week. When we got the 40-hour week, most companies already had the 40-hour week. So the government is a laggard in this, not a leader. And so every country, when it's gone from poverty to way better off, has started with child labor and moved out of it. In my lifetime, when I was a kid, my mother, I was born in 1950, my mother said, clean your plate because children are starving in Korea. It wasn't Europe anymore, it was Korea. And somehow I didn't see how that would prevent them from starving, but okay, I'll eat. In Korea, just in my lifetime, they've moved away from child labor. It's been that dramatic, and that's the story as countries get better off. Your second point about, I know this might be a simplification, but what I kind of heard is the spiritual versus the material. I trust you to make that trade-off. I trust you to decide what material things to give up in order to have what spiritual things. And I don't even know you, so there's no way I should reasonably use force to make that decision for you. And so the great thing about a free society in which wealth is growing is we have more and more opportunities for that. I had lunch today with a young student from this school who's going to take over 6 months after he graduates to travel to literally backpack around the world. And that's an opportunity he has because he and his parents are relatively wealthy. And he can, spiritually find himself or whatever, but that's easier and easier to do because of that wealth. Yes.
My name is Linda, and my question is, I wonder what your take is on the trade sanctions against Iran.
Okay. I think they're a really bad idea. I'm not a big fan of Barack Obama, but one of the few things I think he did right was the negotiated agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons. Because if you fear them getting nuclear weapons, he and the Europeans clearly helped slow it down by a few years at least, probably 10, maybe 15. And so if you look at what upset Donald Trump about what the Iranians did, it had nothing to do with violating any part of the agreement. They were working on missiles. Missiles weren't part of the agreement. The agreement was about nuclear, right? Not about missiles. So I think it was a very bad move. I think he's really hurting those people. And let me also say, the problem with sanctions in general, and this is why I was against the sanctions on Cuba and why I'm against sanctions in general. And I'll tell it with a story from something that happened in my childhood. We had a neighbor named Glenn who had a little bit of a cruel streak, and he had a cat that was a little wild. And one day he came up to my brother Paul, and he put the cat right up against my brother's face, and he pulled the cat's tail. The cat bit my brother. Why do I tell that story? Well, if you look at the argument for sanctions, that's the argument for sanctions. Let's make people in Iran better or worse off, and then they're going to bite their own government. There's one little problem with that. People are smarter than cats. And they know who made them worse off. And it isn't their government. I have some Iranian friends. They don't like their government. But that doesn't mean that Trump, so Trump basically hurt them, and they know who hurt them. And so, no, I think sanctions are generally a bad idea.
My name is Daniel, and I would like to get a clarification on your take on intellectual property and patents.
Yeah.
You seem to suggest that Trump's trade war, if the main motive was to prevent intellectual theft, would be somewhat justified, but isn't patent essentially putting a tariff on ideas?
Ooh.
Wouldn't intellectual theft, in a weird, twisted way, be enforcing free trade on ideas?
Good one. Okay, so I was taking intellectual property as given, but there is a serious literature out there, both in the philosophy literature and in the economics literature, that says, wait a minute. So what if you invented this and I invented it later? Why does your inventing it give you a right to prevent me? And so there was an economist in the 1930s named Sir Arnold Plant. Who here has heard of Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize? He was a Plant student. And we took his article in my industrial organization class at UCLA when I was a graduate student, his article on copyright and his article on patents, and he essentially made your point. And so he made the point that, mainly an economic point, not the philosophical point you made, but that he said, look, if you have patents, it encourages people to invent in the area where they can get patents and not in other areas. And so you might distort the pattern of invention. And if you have patents, of course, there's the point you make that for 20 years, it used to be 17 years, the patent holder has a monopoly, and that does, to some extent, inhibit trade. And so I've got to admit I'm torn. I took, for purposes of this talk, as given that intellectual property is a good idea, but I'm not completely comfortable with it, and I'm not completely comfortable because of the reason you gave.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jim. The question is Bitcoin.
Is what?
Bitcoin.
Oh, okay. What about it?
I was just hoping that you had the answers.
Okay. Well, let me just say, Bitcoin, it's very unlikely that Bitcoin could ever be a medium of exchange in a broad sense, because you want something whose value doesn't fluctuate. And it fluctuates like crazy. The nice thing about the US dollar is we probably know within 2% what it'll be worth in a year. And we don't know that about Bitcoin. So should you hold Bitcoin? Maybe for the same kind of reason people hold gold. Hold it as a little bit of a speculative investment, but not much else.
Thank you so much, David.
Oh, thank you.